Hello, it's Roy. Today, we're going to talk about empathy versus compassion. So it might seem like empathy and compassion are kind of the same thing, but as it turns out, they're not. And so we're going to talk about what some of the differences are and how that can benefit our relations with other people in the workplace, in our schools and churches, in our interpersonal relationships that can be used in a variety of settings. So back in the day, and we still hear this from time to time, there was talk about tolerance. That used to be the thing we were all looking for, was how to be tolerant of other people. And it seemed like that was a high-minded thing at a certain time. And I think as we progressed, we started to realize that tolerance may not actually be a goal that we want to aspire to, that there were some other things that went along with tolerance. So, if we look at the dictionary definition in Merriam-Webster, sympathy or indulgence for beliefs or practices differing or conflicting with our own. Okay, so we're already setting up a them and us kind of a thing when we go with tolerance. And another definition that goes along with this word is the allowable deviation from a standard. Okay, so we already kind of have this baggage where we might be saying, hey, your behavior or your way of operating or thinking is a deviation or maybe a deviant way of doing things. And so that certainly implies some negative connotations there, a sort of a less than kind of a thing. Then we can go into this idea of sympathy. And we look at the definition of what is sympathy. If we're sympathizing with somebody, it's an affinity, association, or relationship between persons or things wherein whatever affects one similarly affects the other. Okay, so if this is bad for you, then this is bad for everybody. Or if you experience this problem with your particular set of circumstances, then that might come into effect me at some point, or somebody I know and care about. And so that is kind of trying to get closer to the same, to a connection here where we've got something we can share. And the inclination with sympathy is to think or feel similarly, and that could be emotionally and or intellectually. And that doesn't mean that if we sympathize with someone, of course, that we agree with everything they say. Sympathy can very much be situational. It could be that, I can sympathize with a person over a particular situation, like, say, the loss of a parent, or the loss of a job, or difficulty with a particular work task. And I can sympathize with them in that way, and in that kind of a situational framework. That leads us into part of what we're talking about here of empathy. And empathy seems like, wow, that's a great way to go. And maybe that's where we really should be. And so let's unpack empathy for a minute. Empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So that last part of the definition there is pretty wordy. And if we unpack that, so we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, is empathizing is going beyond sympathizing. Empathizing is we're actually vicariously experiencing, that is, we're putting ourselves in the place of the other person, and we're starting to actually be impacted by that. We're starting to feel what they're feeling, which is definitely a step further. It's beyond tolerance, and it's beyond sympathy. Now let's look at compassion. We look at what compassion's definition is: sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it. And so I think that's something we can see in common in sympathy and empathy, is that we would love to, we desire to help somebody with a situation that they might be experiencing. Okay. Some of the synonyms or other words that are associated with the word compassion are things like kindness and generosity, mercy, understanding, and rapport. Again, rapport, if we look at rapport, that's us kind of being on the same page with somebody else, talking the same language, or we understand each other. That can also be very situational. We're talking about that with sympathy. So it could be that maybe we don't agree on certain things, but we have a rapport when we deal with this particular task at work. We both understand it, me and another person. We have the same kind of objective and way of doing things that we think is the best way. So we could have a rapport about that, but we might not have it in other situations. But anyway, that's all associated with this idea of compassion. So let's break down some of the differences between empathy and compassion. So again, empathy is actually putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes so we can feel some of what they are experiencing. Compassion's different. We're feeling an understanding for another person's situation with kindness and goodwill. So one is we're actually feeling it, and the other one is we're understanding for the other person what they're experiencing. And that distinction is important. So looking a little bit further, empathy, we're feeling their pain. We're actually experiencing that in ourselves if we're, truly empathizing and they're going through something very difficult. Once we take that on, once we start taking in that pain or that weight in ourselves, then we can have our focus be shifted from the other person to our own feelings that we're experiencing now. We've taken on their situation, their feelings or whatever, and we are now experiencing some of what they're experiencing. That process that occurs can actually make us less likely to offer them assistance, which is kind of counterintuitive. I think many of us would think that empathy would be a great thing. And it's not that being empathetic is bad necessarily, but if all we're doing is empathizing, we can find ourselves in this situation. Looking at compassion, again, we're seeking to understand what another is going through and be kind, but we're not actually taking on the feelings. And that lets us stay engaged and focus on the other person instead of focusing on ourselves. Doing that makes us more likely to stay engaged and to help them, to lend a hand, to be of benefit and use to the other person. So, of all the different things we've talked about, compassion seems like maybe that's a good target to go for. And I think this also is helpful, if we're trying to utilize or build up a skill for compassion over empathy. If we start feeling the pain of another person when we're interacting with them, then we may be bringing it into ourselves more than actually trying to understand them and keeping enough of a distance to be helpful. So that could be a warning sign that maybe we want to not go down that path and maybe put, just a little bit of distance for the purpose of being useful and actually helping the person. And that may be a more beneficial way for us to go. Professor Dr. Tanya Singer says a lack of compassion is arguably the cause of humankind's biggest failures. And you can find her website. That's a link that's on the presentation there, but you can certainly find, she's got her own website out there. And that might be of interest to you if you want to explore this topic further. So, this all kind of crystallizes down to this idea: when we stop projecting how we feel, we can pay attention to what another person really needs, and then we can be beneficial to them. And this can really pay dividends, in the workplace as we try to encounter each other, and we're all in different places and we're trying to get a common goal done. In order to do that, sometimes it can be very helpful in interpersonal relations for us to, we can be helpful to somebody else without actually taking on their pain. And by not getting into that kind of a spin down cycle where you are going down with the other person, we can actually help them. And that'll help us all achieve our goals collectively. So I hope you found some of these concepts useful and helpful. And you guys have a great day. Be kind.